So as I say, welcome to part 2 of Develop Your A-Level Teaching. Unfortunately, we are still remote and will most likely be remote for our next meeting in February. But whilst much remains up in the air with A-levels and exams this summer, and actually reports suggest we might see some significant changes announced in the next week or so, it's important to reiterate that as teachers, the most important thing we can do at the moment is really focus on making every single minute we have with our sixth formers as impactful as it can be. And I thought last meeting was really great around metacognition and the way that students think and have to think at A-level. And again, huge thanks to the members of staff from Spring West and Reach that sort of facilitated our keynote discussions last time. Today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Amanda Fleck from Brentford School for Girls, who will be talking about literacy and oracy, and Juliette from Gumley, Juliette Claro from Gumley, who will also be continuing that theme. So without further ado, I will hand over to Amanda from Brentford School for Girls to begin the keynote today. Hello, Amanda, can you hear me? Okay, I think we might be having some technical problems with Amanda. So what we'll do is we'll start with Juliette from Gumley. Juliette, sorry to jump that on you. And Emma will just flick through to the right slides, and then we'll have Amanda's session next.
It makes sense to have Amanda first because she is the brain behind all of this. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Beautiful. So I wish normally would do this after Amanda because she has done a huge amount of work with the HEP research that she's done with them. So I'm going to introduce the work that we've done at Gumley, and I'm presenting on the behalf of the staff at Gumley and all the work that they've done based on Amanda's training that she delivered to our school last year before we went into lockdown. So next slide, Amanda, please. So what we did, Emma, sorry. Yeah, thanks. It emerged from our CPD focus that we had last year. Amanda came kindly to our school in September. She delivered a lovely session where we really reviewed our literacy skills and we really questioned what we were doing with our students. And we really started to look at our tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary. So tier 2 looking mainly at the command words and the words that students need to know to navigate the papers for the exams. And knowing that some papers, like the chemistry paper, you have something like 2,000 to 4,000 words, and some of them is really overwhelming. So we looked at these words in more details in form time, and we also looked at them into PSHCE as well. And the tier 3 is drilled now into the classroom. Teachers actually have a massive amount of drilling, including all of the techniques that Amanda has actually was going to talk to you in a minute, but obviously it's going to be reversed now. So in practice, what does that look like in the Gumley classroom? So I've got lots of resources that our staff has combined for all of you that you can perhaps share in your keynotes and in your breakout session later. So little things from vocabulary point of view, Emma, if you don't want. Yeah. Practical ideas for the classroom. So our Do It Now activity for subject now, we have lots of word definitions and match up and gap fill activities. So something that we would normally do in the lower school, we actually transfer that to Key Stage 5 because we think that year 12 or technically year 11 with a uniform on, with no uniform actually. So we need to kind of treat them as they, especially after lockdown, or how they're actually trying to navigate on vocabulary. And we do lots of things like spot the mistakes. What's the problem here? Can you remember what this word means and how to put it in a context, in a sentence? We would probably show them a little idea, a question from an examiner, and how we can better it, how can we improve the sentence and as a starter activity. And languages, obviously, we do vocab tests, but we also have moved the vocab tests in other subjects, especially when you have to drill key concepts and complex concepts, some things that sociology, psychology would probably find difficult to drill. We give them a definition and they have to match up with the words and how it works. The key domino starter activity with geography is really good as well. For example, they have a word and they have to actually find the definitions and that have to, in the classroom, put the dominoes together. And that helps them to actually really manipulate and understand concepts and complex words. Glossaries. So we are a PIXL school. We're not ashamed to say that. Actually, we have lots of lovely resources from PIXL, and we have actually been using all the glossaries that they actually have on your PIXL Unlock. So if you don't have that, I would strongly recommend you do have a look at them. And students have them for all their subjects, and they can refer back to it. And we have a literacy e-box with model answers, grade 9 for GCSE, but A-star essays, so they can have a look at what it looks like, what the top grade looks like, with key vocabulary and key structures and sentences, so they can see what it looks like if I was getting the top mark for that particular question. In maths, for example, they have the common words in the folders. They look at team playing and team planning, who is the expert and what, for example, students could explain what these words mean and really try to understand what the question in maths actually asks them to do, because some words might not mean the same thing from one subject to another. So it's quite important that I have seen a lot of our teachers in maths actually asking, what exactly are we asked to do here? Excuse me. What prior knowledge is required and how would you introduce the topic? Physics tips for understanding complex words. So here is something that we deliver with our students, where we try to get the students to picture exactly what's happening in the effect with the experiment. So we encourage students to understand the phenomenon first and try to give them the words on the board so they can actually word it and out loud to actually pronounce the word. That sometimes they can't even pronounce those words in science. So make them say out loud and try to put the words in a context, in a sentence, so they can explain what they saw in the experiment and conceptualize what they've seen in real life with the words. But the words they would not necessarily use in real life because they are very complex and quite pompous words. So we try to make them repeat those words out loud and put them in a sentence and play around, and how can I better that explanation of what's happened phenomenon. So we give them something like maybe 6 or 7 words, and we're trying to make them build those sentences and explain in their own words what's happening in the physics or the chemistry reaction, and try to make them use longer and more complex sentences to get the top grade when they answer a longer type question. Brain dumps and starter activities that we use quite a lot. So we give them the keywords in advance, and they have to basically brain dump them on a piece of paper, mind map the key concepts, and they have to basically put on a massive piece of A3, and some other people or some of the students might add some other words. So those who have not used the keywords, they are actually encouraged by their peers to say, well, actually, you could have used that word here, and try to improve each other's work. So they do the mind map in the guided study period. They put it on the board, they put it on the wall, they pin it, and then they have like 5 or 10 minutes to actually go around and improve it. And look, this one is particularly for French, for example. That was the chronology of immigration in France. And they had to basically put it all together, and they had to use keywords that are related to decolonization and the slave trade, and those key concepts that are quite complex for them to understand in a foreign language. So the key exercise here is to make sure that when they do the brain dump and the brainstorm activity, they have to use the top grade words to make sure that they are confident using them again when they write an essay or when they do a speaking activity, for example. Modeling essay, that's something you might be familiar with. There's lots of blog on Twitter about this, but that's basically the essay strip. Nothing really exciting, but actually works really well for students who are the borderline students where you just scrap the 6 and manage to get and make it to A-level. And they really struggle to structure their essay and actually find the right words to explain what they want to say. So politics use it quite a lot, and humanities. I've borrowed it from the humanities department, actually. Thank you, Dan, for that. I actually nicked it and make it for the French, and that's one of my essay for the student who actually got a CAC grade of a 6. And the CAC grade of a 6 is, you know what that means, okay? You've been there. So she's doing A-level French, and it's really finding it difficult to structure things. So it does work using the structure strip when they have to write longer passages and help them to build the structure of the thinking, how they're going to put it on paper. But also in the strip, you can use the complex word and show them exactly what word they need to use and include in the essay to get the top grade or the top mark in that band. And here we have an example of history. So for this exam, paper, what they've done is they've given them the mark scheme, but they've also given them, you can't really see, but basically what's happening in the little box here is the teachers has given them clear words that they have to use in the essay with a clear structure and a clear model on what worked in that particular paper. So this is a good example, and modeling again, we've done modeling before, but actually showing them what an A or an A star would look like, why is it a good essay, and what are the keywords that they need to look for. And if you look on the next slide, our teacher actually color-coded it for students who find it really even harder to actually process all this information. The concept of, point evidence explanation, here you can color-code it for the students with lots of really keywords that they need to know, that they need to introduce and use flow. Sometimes it's the flow of writing from longer passages that they find difficult to use. So this is from Teresa, who's our literacy coordinator, and actually she found that color coding things was really helping the students. So we nicked that in languages and actually worked really well as well for low ability students who find it hard to structure things. And again, here you can see emphasizing the use of complex vocabulary. So in the box on the left-hand side, what they've done is they've given them the keywords they want to see in the exam, and they have to, using the model that they've had before, create their own sentences and their own paragraphs. And when they actually getting the work back, they have usually some feedback on how they've done with this particular piece of work. The good thing about this grade is you can actually help them to do self-assessment, peer assessment, as well as using it with your own marking. But the key thing is to give them the keywords and the complex word you want to see, so then they access the top band of the mark scheme. So here we're talking about referring to English language, and sometimes it's difficult when you're not an English teacher or a language teacher. But things that you would do in English when you're debating, you need to emphasize them to say, can you rephrase your point using another word or using an expression? And sometimes we just assume that, saying, well, it's like, it's a thing in it. It's like, yeah, and it's like, and sometimes there's a lot of like on how they speak, because that's the way they punctuating the thinking, is kind of the way they're processing their oracy. But when you do discussion and debating in the classroom, it's important that we emphasize the use of good language and using those keywords that they need to be using in your exam. So spend 5 minutes in your subject to teach grammar. It's important, good grammar in English. And if you're not sure how to do this, just have a quick chat with your English team or your language department, who are used to teach, very key aspect of grammar and order of words, syntax and structure and punctuation, because that is a big thing for them to actually access the top grade. And show students how to look for words online. That's something that a lot of our philosophy and religious studies do, is to show them that Wikipedia is not probably the best way to look for things. So show them on the screen, I don't know that word, I need another word to say what I'm trying to say. Show them how to look for a word, or sometimes a thesaurus or something like that online. They're not necessarily confident doing that, although they have been taught in English to do that in the lower school, but they forget things. Show them how to nominalize and concise their work, and sometimes in subject like biology or chemistry or maths, you might think, well, actually it's not necessary, I don't really need to do that for my subject. So it does help them to manage things and to make things, improve their work in the long term. Guided independent reading and the use of tier 3 in real life. So this is something, I'm so sorry, Dan, I screenshot your Google Classroom here, but encouraging them to read and read for pleasure, and having articles to read in their own time and discussing it as a debate in the classroom. That's really important. So things that, if you do it regularly, what's happening is your student will find stuff and post them on your platform, and it comes into a discussion. So that's something that politics does really well, and history, languages, we do that quite a lot as well. But encourage them to read for your subject, read for pleasure, and encourage them to talk about what they've read. Do you think it's relevant? How could you apply this into in your classroom? I also use things from Twitter, Twitterati that I find from the language department. Sometimes I share them with the students. I said, do you think that would work? Do you think we could use this language in an essay? And they actually ponder it, and for them it's actually helping them to think through the process of writing their essay. That was it from me. That's very short. I tried to make it very short. Hopefully Amanda is back in. But thank you to the Gumley staff for sharing all their resources. That's fantastic.
So thank you very much, Juliette. Amanda is indeed now back and technical difficulties are sorted.
Yeah,
so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Amanda Fleck from Brentford School for Girls. Thank you.
Hello, I was fortunate enough to go to Gumley and speak to the teachers there just about this EEF report and the importance of the EEF report. So if we're looking here at reading, so reading is an absolute fundamental in an academic subject, and what we forget is how challenging it is. This is an exercise that we use, just glance over it, and what you will see is the fact that it's really, really challenging to understand some of these words, and this is the technical language that we're doing all the time. So if we move on to the next slide, and what we can see is we can see here how we could make it clearer for those words by using a glossary, by getting students to talk about it, by actually using a bit of colour coding, as Juliette said, because this language is challenging to read. So this comes from the Education Endowment, improving literacy in secondary schools. And this is an absolute game changer for schools, I think, because it allows us to, it gives us the sort of scope to look at literacy through all of the subjects. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just going to have a quick look, a very, very quick look at the first three. Literacy and academic vocabulary guidance, looking at vocabulary, disciplinary literacy, and sort of reading complex academic texts, because this does have a huge impact at A level. So what do we mean by literacy and language? These are often confused. Language development occurs within families. It doesn't have to necessarily be explicitly taught, and it involves the development of skills used to communicate with others through languages. There's a fantastic little CPD from Seneca there about how children actually develop language. And literacy is the ability to read and write. And I think language is really important, because what we find is, I mean, I'm a biology teacher, which is like learning a whole new language. And I think the focus is, as a lot of people say, is oracy comes before literacy. So in order to be able to read and write about whatever subject we're doing, we need the words to do it. We need the language to be able to do that. And that's why it's vital to not just focus on the written and reading and writing, but actually on language development as well. What can we do to develop language? Thanks. So recommendation 1, prioritise disciplinary literacy across the curriculum. And what this means is that we've got to look at it through the lens of individual subjects, rather than looking at it and saying, well, that's English's responsibility or the literacy coordinator across the school. We've got to talk about what is unique about our subject. And listening to Juliette talking about all the different subjects, and actually she has a plethora of strategies and suggestions that go across the subjects. And that's what we need to do. Every teacher, they used to say every teacher is a teacher of literacy. And what that means is within your subject. You know, teachers who've been teaching for a while will know that there's been lots of literacy strategies, and some of them don't necessarily meet the needs of your subject. I think that's why disciplinary literacy is important. How does literacy, what does literacy look like in your subject? How do students read and write about your subject? How do students speak about your subject? Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is looking at vocabulary across the subjects. It's a great little blog, and it looks at what if it means something slightly different. I had an interesting conversation about lumens, of all things. My husband's a physicist, my best friend is a physics teacher, and I'm a biologist. And she was saying she used to work for a company called Lumen. I'm imagining in my head the lumen, which is the sort of the hole inside an artery, and my husband and my friend were thinking about lumens as in a measure of light. And it's that sort of thing, language that spans different subjects, but the same language that spans different subjects but means different things. And I think that's something that we have to bear in mind for our students, and we can't assume that they know, just because they know a word, that they know it in the context of our subject. So provide targeted vocabulary instruction. There is a 30 million word gap, and that word gap does not decrease, and it's between the wealthiest and the poorest families. It doesn't really decrease through secondary school. unless we put in interventions. It is evident from 18 months old, and 60%, this was some research that was done in 2018, 60% of teachers thought that the children who came in year 7 with low vocabulary, in year 11, they have low vocabulary. So by the time we're getting them at A level, there's still students who have low vocabulary, and we've got some students who have had low reading ages, even though they're quite articulate, but they just don't necessarily have the language. So subject-specific terminology. So how many are there? This is from my A-level biology, and this is something that I do regularly. We actually decode this language. We spend a lot of time decoding the language, because if we don't decode the language, we are not going to understand it. I spend a lot of time using root words and sort of looking at prefixes and suffixes and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the tiers of vocabulary, I think these are particularly important all the way through, and especially at sixth form. Tier 2 vocabulary is about words that are found generally in writing or in reading, not generally in the language that we use. And some tier 2 vocabulary will actually be tier 3 vocabulary for our subjects. So we need to be aware of where these stumbling blocks are. What is a student reading and writing about in your subject where they are going to struggle with what we would assume everyday academic language? If they've not been exposed to this, they are not going to manage. I think teachers now and schools now are absolutely incredible at tier 3 language, but like I said before, you've got to think about where the crossover is between the tier 3 language and the tier 2 language, and how it's actually different in different subjects. Slide, please. Thank you. So this is just an example of one, a tissue. So tissue is something you blow your nose on, but in science, a tissue is has got a specific meaning. And students may have heard of the word tissue, but if they may be even confused, even up towards A level. Weight is another one. It's exactly the same, and this is used to sort of the pain of every single physics teacher ever. It's always used incorrectly, and we have to make those, and even at A level, that we have to make sure that we are using that language correctly. So looking at morphology, like I said, it's looking at prefixes, roots, and suffixes. And I spend a lot of time at the beginning of my A-level lessons talking about the morphology of words, and even at year 11 biology and chemistry, to make sure that they've got a good understanding. So that I think Juliette was saying earlier about things like pronunciation, breaking the words down. How do we get the meaning from the words? How are we looking at families of words that have got the same suffix or the same prefix? And what do they actually mean? So they can have a clearer understanding of the language without actually having to memorize every single word. And this is an example of breaking down word photosynthesis. I'm just teaching photosynthesis now with my year 13s, and we will go over this again. What does it actually mean? How do we learn things by looking at how this word breaks down? And you can't do it for every word, but I think in certain subjects that it really lends itself to looking at the sort of morphology. How do we break down these words, and what are the commonalities between the prefixes and the suffixes? And then looking at etymology, and this is looking at the meanings of words. And for me, I think don't force it if it doesn't exist. Look at the sort of historical background, where the words have come from, the Latin and Greek roots, just to give a better understanding of what that actually means. So recommendations: the ability to read complex text. Training needs to be focused on this. Students cannot just read complex text. We can't give them a textbook. As I said, I've been teaching respiration and photosynthesis. If my students were trying to learn about respiration and photosynthesis from reading the book, they would really, really struggle. I listened to a talk the other day from the National Literacy Centre, and we need to instruct our students on how to read their books, how to make meaning of what they are reading. And to comprehend them, students need to actively engage with what they're reading and use their existing subject knowledge. The subject knowledge is what everything hangs on. If you haven't got subject knowledge, you will not be able to read that text. You won't have the vocabulary. You won't be able to link those things either. So this is an A-level biology textbook, and this is what I've just been teaching, respiration. My students cannot read this and make meaning of it. So we had to decode it. We looked at diagrams, we looked at how it worked, and then they read it again and they could make meaning from it and then make their own notes on it, because it's complex processes that are involved. extremely high reading age due to the polysyllabic word. So it makes it really, really complex. And just because they can read it and decode it does not mean to say they can take an understanding from it. And that's what we need to work on at A level, is making sure that we help students to be able to gain an understanding from the text that they are reading. So this is just an example that I use, and I use this in training for teachers and actually with my students. If you give students this to read, every single student who has a chronological reading age, and every A-level student will be able to answer these questions without understanding any of it. It is a nonsense poem. It makes no sense. But the way the questions are framed, they are not very good comprehension questions. So we can get all the correct answers with very, very little understanding. So what I would say is that we need to look really, really carefully at the questions that we are asking on text. Train students to read text, train students to answer questions on that text, and model it and practice, practice, practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And a huge thank you to both Juliette and Amanda there, and some really important issues covered. I have to admit, Amanda, that I gave up on the biology text there by about line 2. It was too much for me, but at least I could answer the Jabberwocky questions. I think some really pertinent points there in the sense that I know at A level there's too much acceptance probably from us all that sixth form students should know words, should know how to write, and should know how to talk. And I think today is reiterated that too often they simply don't. So there are some very, very important questions for us to address, particularly in our subject areas and from a subject perspective. And I've listed a few here in terms of what is going to be difficult from a student perspective. How can we best prepare students for this? And I think Amanda and Juliette have both given us some really good strategies there to apply in our classroom. So how in our subjects can we use those strategies to better teach sections? And what reading and writing support can we include with this? So we're about to break into some into our subject groups, and I think everyone should have been sent their Zoom invites. If I could just reiterate before we do that, a huge thank you to Amanda and Juliette, because it is a huge amount of work goes into these sort of presentations. But also when we go into our groups, really what we put in our groups is what we'll get out in our subject areas. And I think the feedback from some delegates last time were too many people weren't perhaps inputting as much as they might do. Cameras were off. So if we can all go in our subject areas, please make sure cameras are on, we're all participating, and I'm sure we'll have a really, really good sort of 45 minute to an hour discussion. I'm running one of the history groups, and obviously my Zoom period of time I'm allowed for free is 40 minutes. So all I'm going to do in that instance is give people a 5-minute comfort break halfway through and log on again to make sure that we can fill our allocated time without sort of Zoom logging me out. So that might be one way for people to think about. So I hope everyone has enjoyed the keynotes. I'd like to thank Amanda and Juliette for one final time, and I hope everyone has a really meaningful discussion in their subject groups. So if everyone can log into those now, please. Thank you very much.